Okay, just like Sarek's time-lapse martial arts a few episodes ago, Saru's CGI run in this episode, fantastic. No notes, we need more CGI Saru running in Star Trek. Hello interwebs and welcome to my ongoing retro review series of Star Trek Discovery Season 1 being done in preparation for Star Trek Discovery's 5th and final season coming later this year. And actually, since I last recorded, we have an air date for Discovery's final season, or at least this season premiere, and that is April 4th, 2024. So 4/4/24. Don't know what that means, come up with your own conspiracy theories, but I'm excited! I mean, they could have waited one more week so that it would have lined up with this retro review series that I wouldn't have to double up 1 week in order to time it to end before Season 5 starts, but, you know, we already knew this. The Star Trek Discovery writers hate all Trekkies and me specifically. At least that's what they keep saying on Twitter, that they hate all Trekkies and me specifically. Or did they mean them? I'm sure it's entirely justified. Twitter's always full of people entirely justified in their anger. But actually, seriously though, it is very bittersweet. I am very excited for Discovery's final season. It's a Romulan treasure hunt, I guess, which sounds very cool. But before then, we still have to get through Star Trek Discovery Season 1. Continuing on with this week's episode titled... bunch of Latin words I'm not gonna say. Sic Vis Pacem Bellum? Did I do it? Someone in the comments let me know if I did it. I probably didn't. This is actually the first episode this season that I feel really didn't hit it for me, even though I found a lot more to love about it on a rewatch than I did the first time. And my overall dissatisfaction mostly comes down to the fact that it just feels incomplete and rushed. It's clear that the episode is trying to talk about the sometimes need for violence and where the desire to enact violence has to come from in order for it not to turn into something darker, but the exploration of it in the episode all feels very surface level because it has to squeeze into the ongoing serialized story. In fact, I think this is the first time this season where I don't think the episode really balanced the serialization and episodic elements, which is something that I think sadly becomes a greater and greater issue for Discovery and also Picard. That said, the concept is great. If last week's episode, Magic to Make the Sanest Man Go Mad, was meant to evoke the Next Generation episode Cause and Effect, this episode was clearly meant to evoke the philosophically focused away mission episodes of the original series, a la the introductory Klingon episode, The Errand of Mercy. The episode even has the phaser-heated rocks from The Enemy Within, which is a fun, nerdy Easter egg. Sic Parabellum starts off with a great sequence of Discovery trying and failing to save a fellow Federation vessel, showing us the ongoing stakes and cost of the Klingon War, but also building up the threat of the cloaking technology being used by the Klingons now that Kor has harvested it from T'Kuvma's ship.
Eventually, every ship in the Klingon armada will be able to attack us out of nowhere.
The scene also nicely shows Lorca's competence, yet dispassionate captaining style.
Let's keep our fingers on the trigger, get ready to move quickly. Understood?
Aye, Captain.
Jason Isaacs plays the scene as someone well used to a well-oiled machine of war like he gets in the Terran Empire that he's not 100% getting with his lovey-dovey Federation crew, but has slowly started to mold them into getting there.
Got anything?
Negative, sir.
And frankly, this scene works way better now that I've watched Discovery for 4 seasons because I've grown to have an affinity for characters like Owo, Detmer, and Bryce and the rest of the bridge background players of the Discovery. They're still not full characters even at season 4 of Discovery, but I'm used to their presence and who they are in a way that I wasn't when I watched Star Trek Discovery season 1. So now, seeing how they act under normal circumstances in future seasons under compassionate leaders like Captain Pike, the bridge crew's stress under pressure in this scene works much better. You can see the little differences in how they have to act under someone like Lorca.
Mr. Reese, could I trouble you to fire at something?
Aye, sir.
So this is actually sadly an artifact of the way that Discovery Season 1 decided to tell its story with its focus on atypical officers like Burnham. I had no behavior to compare these bridge officers against when I watched this the first time, so this scene's purpose was less stark. But now watching again, I can see that the scene is trying to show that while Lorca's decisiveness is necessary during war, he still dehumanized his crew in the process of getting there.
There will be time to grieve. This is not that time.
And this isn't just something done because he is a fascist. War, by its very nature, dehumanizes those who take part in it. This theme of war and violence, dehumanizing both the people that it is used against and those enacting it, is a theme that we will follow through with the characters Burnham, Saru, and Tyler. Those three are on a new planet called Pavo in order to use its natural transmitter-like crystal structure to detect cloaked Klingon ships. And I love the look of this planet. It's so beautiful and cool. The structures, the designs, and all the weird elements I want from Star Trek are here. And the idea that this planet represents is cool too. The Pavans, energy beings, are completely innocent and in many ways naive. They want to help the Discovery crew in any way they can, whether it be taking away Saru's anxiety or letting the crew use their transmitter for the Klingon War. Their world only knows peace, and so they're willing to acquiesce to any request given of them. They haven't been used to things like imperialism or active violence. It's here we get Discovery's first real in-depth discussion of the Prime Directive on a philosophical level, and it actually is one of the better ways that I've seen it used within Star Trek. Oftentimes the Prime Directive can come off as this condescension towards what the Federation deems less evolved species, or can be used to justify atrocities like we see in episodes like Dear Doctor, with this underlying assumption of there being a correct way for species to evolve, which kind of alludes to something like predestination or God. But in this episode, it's actually used in a way that fits what its initial impulse was, which was to attempt to check colonialist impulses by a larger power like the Federation. Burnham cautions against getting involved with the Pavans using the Prime Directive to argue that number one, we might be taking their resources that they might need, and two, might get them involved in a conflict that they had no idea about or were unprepared for. It still fits into this idea of like the benevolent colonialist that we can have a larger discussion on within Star Trek as a sort of discussion on like Imperial Empire as it represents in Star Trek. But here, at least it's being used properly in a way that I think fits what its intention was. But moving on though, Burnham and Tyler get drawn into imagining a life without war that the Pavans represent.
Our futures look different. You go back to your lake house. And I go back to prison.
But Burnham knows that if the war ends, she'll still have to go back to prison. She and Tyler can't completely leave behind their past. They still have to carry it with them. Burnham's trauma and actions still define her as much as she wants to let go of that baggage. Tyler, though, tries to argue that they couldn't just let go of all their burdens.
Well, maybe we just leave that transmitter alone. You can't go back to prison if we're still at war.
And it's kind of a fucked up suggestion and would lead to the deaths of many in the Klingon War that they just washed their hands of, but given Tyler is selfishly focused on Burnham at the moment and also a Klingon spy at the same time, it works. I also love that this sequence twists the phrases the needs of the many versus the needs of the one.
The needs of the many.
Worth fighting for. Or worth dying for. But so are the needs of the few.
Or the one.
It's demonstrating that these common Star Trek aphorisms that Trekkies like to spout mean nothing without understanding and moral guidance underneath them guiding them. Yes, the phrase "the needs of the many" is beautiful when Spock sacrifices himself to save his entire ship, but that phrase can also be used to justify atrocities against the marginalized. Meanwhile, the phrase "the needs of the one" is great when we're talking about a group of people going to rescue their friend, but it can also be used to justify totalitarianism. So this all demonstrates what Star Trek also tells us, that logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. The Pavan's untouched world is also an intoxicant to Saru, who has his fear that he has biologically lived with his entire life taken away, pushing him to want to leave the Klingon War entirely, thinking that he can stay on the planet, to the point of even cutting off communication with Discovery.
In perfect balance and absolute harmony with their world. They have already achieved everything we say we seek through our exploratory and diplomatic efforts.
Burnham and Tyler know that this is misguided. The war will continue regardless and may even come for the Pavans and Saru himself, regardless of whether Saru divests himself of it or not. This showcases how fear is what guides Saru constantly, and his fear can be crippling, but it's also a lack of fear that makes him lose his drive to fight back against things like Klingon supremacy. We also get the opposite point of view of Saru from Ash Tyler, who immediately takes control and says he'll force the issue and use the transmitter anyways, not breaking the Prime Directive, but only on a technicality.
No starship may interfere with the normal development of any alien life or society.
Saru said they would grant us anything, right? Well, modifying the transmitter is included in anything.
But we can't trust anything that he...
Michael, this may be our only way of ending the war.
Then, in a scene where he attempts to delay Saru, Tyler reveals that he only seeks vengeance in the Klingon War.
Everybody wants to defeat the Klingons. I want to hurt them.
They tortured you. The feeling is understandable. But all that is past now.
You don't just forget something like that. You can't.
What's the other option? Allowing it to transform you into something worse than those who did this?
His anger and aggrievement are what guides him, which stands in contrast to Saru, yet it's also destructive. Vengeance is not about building, it's about getting back, and constantly justifies more and more violence. You have to have something that you are fighting for. And given that Voke is a Klingon sleeper agent and doesn't actually believe in the idealism of Starfleet, this makes sense. I also love that the episode sets up a to be continued, with the Pavans being so naive that they welcome the Klingons to a peace talk with the Discovery, without realizing that they just opened themselves up to a possible genocide and attack by the Klingons, with the Discovery now needing to defend these pacifist people.
We're the Pavans' only line of defense.
In the end, all of this is great philosophical fodder for discussions on why we fight wars against fascism and hate. Why do we use violence? Which should never just be for violence's sake or out of a desire for power or to gain resources. America, you can learn some things, but neither should it be out of fear or shallow idealism. Because neither of those things are enough to actually motivate good actions when discussing the use of violence. But the episode also presents on the opposite coin how pacifism, while sometimes noble, when done naively through self-interest or with a lack of desire to push back against hate, fascism, or further violence in hopes of staying neutral, just ultimately lets harm continue. These are all ideas touched upon and given to appropriate characters to say them, but it's really never given any proper exploration or grounded in much actually happening within the episode. There's no real exploration of the depths of these concepts or complications to them given either. It is thoughtful stuff, and it is this episode clearly setting up characters' arcs for future episodes, but makes for a weightless story in the here and now. L'Rell's scenes also feel equally rushed. I love the idea of L'Rell trying to walk the middle path of being willing to play both Starfleet and Kor for her own ends, instigated by her clearly not liking Kor's perversion of T'Kuvma's unity through hegemony doctrine turned towards more overt Klingon supremacy under Kor. This mirrors things like the systemic white supremacy in our society often being adopted by fascistic dictators who will gladly use up their radicalized followers, but are really just about propping up their own totalitarian desires. So L'Rell's surprise at Starfleet's more humanistic doctrine as she interrogates Cornwell is interesting given the hypocrisy underlying her unity through hegemony idea that she believes under T'Kuvma, that we explored in previous episodes.
So you do not execute them?
The Federation has no death penalty.
This sets her up for starting to have a change of heart by encountering new ideas and concepts outside of her twisted radicalization under T'Kuvma, but still her not being fully able to break from it. Yet this too is done incredibly quickly, and it's hard to grasp the totality of her character arc here. The issue is that we're never able to get into L'Rell's head because we don't know if she's manipulating Cornwell or not. Even by the episode's end, we're not entirely sure what the order of events going on in her brain were, given that we're given options for it to have been both ways. It could have been that L'Rell was manipulating Cornwell in order to get propped up further in Kor's hierarchy, but then has a change of heart when she sees the followers of T'Kuvma that Kor had killed.
Classic.
But this change in motivation doesn't line up with her next scene where we clearly see that she's trying to get in with Kor, and is then betrayed by Kor, who sends her away. It could have been the opposite way too. She could have wanted to actually earnestly defect to Starfleet and then decides not to when she's caught, but then that makes the scene where she sees the dead bodies of her friends somewhat unnecessary for her character arc. As a result, even by episode's end, I can't really give you a clear reading on L'Rell's character arc, which just muddies her character. It's totally fine to have a twist revelation for a character, but the revelation should then inform all the previous scenes, which this doesn't really because it's unclear what the revelation is pointing towards in terms of where L'Rell finally comes down in what she's believing in by the episode's end. The same thing happens here with Cornwell's unclear death. I know, having seen the rest of the season, that Cornwell survives, but this episode plays it that she very clearly died here. Like, very clearly. So when she does come back later, it feels like a weird cop-out, though I have to assume this was always the intention to have her come back. It would have been probably better to leave it more ambiguous on if she died or not, so that it feels more definitive later on. I just chalk that up to either bad directing or cinematography, or no one telling the director or cinematographer that Cornwell was going to come back when they filmed the episode. On top of this, we get a couple brief sequences with Stamets and Tilly setting up the mirror universe twist later on down the road.
1 minute, I know where I am, who you are, what I'm doing, and then all of a sudden, what I know changes.
Which is ultimately just fine. I do like Stamets and Tilly's growing relationship that becomes a larger thing as the series goes on, but on the whole, it's mostly inconsequential in this episode. Stamets saying that his entire worldview shifts when he goes into the mind of Mirror Universe Stamets could represent how fascism can warp your entire worldview, but really that's me searching for a thematic relevance for something that's just mostly set up. Overall, rushed and surface level is the best description that I can give to this episode. While I love a lot of its ideas and it's a fun ode to the original series style of storytelling, and it is perhaps a necessary setup for later stories, there's just not enough meat here in this episode itself, and what meat there is sometimes confusingly communicated. While I don't hate this episode, and I do love that it gives a bit of depth to Saru's feelings of anxiety and fear that would be explored more in Season 2 onwards, I can't help but feel disappointed for the first time this season. That's my thoughts on Bellum episode of Star Trek Discovery. I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. I will be back next week for next week's episode of Star Trek Discovery Season 1, and I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper.